Did Lucifer rebel against God because he wanted to be like God and have his own throne? One of the most popular and influential interpretations of Lucifer's rebellion is that he was motivated by pride and envy. He wanted to be like God and have his own throne, and he refused to worship God or serve his plan. This interpretation is based on a passage in Isaiah 14 verses 13 to 14, where the prophet taunts the king of Babylon, who had oppressed Israel, by saying, "You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God, I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the utmost heights of the sacred mountain. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High." Many people have assumed that this passage is actually about Lucifer, and that he uttered these words before or during his rebellion. However, this assumption is not supported by the biblical context or the original language. Here are some reasons why this interpretation is problematic. The passage is clearly addressed to the king of Babylon, not to Lucifer. The prophet identifies him by name in verse 4, and describes his historical deeds and fate in verses 15 to 23. The passage is part of a series of oracles against various nations that had oppressed Israel, such as Assyria, Philistia, Moab, and Egypt. There is no indication that the prophet switches from a human king to a celestial being in the middle of his speech. The passage uses figurative language and imagery to mock the king of Babylon's arrogance and ambition. The prophet compares him to a star that falls from heaven, a common metaphor for a fallen ruler in ancient Near Eastern literature. He also compares him to a mythical king who ruled over a mountain paradise called Zaphon, where the Canaanite gods dwelt. The prophet uses these images to contrast the king's lofty claims with his lowly destiny. He will be thrown down to Sheol, the realm of the dead, where he will be despised and forgotten. The phrase "I will make myself like the Most High" does not mean that the king of Babylon wanted to be equal to God or usurp his authority. The Hebrew word for Most High, Elyon, can also mean highest or supreme in a relative sense. The king of Babylon wanted to be the highest and supreme ruler among all other kings and nations. He wanted to dominate the world and establish his own glory and power. Therefore, this passage does not describe Lucifer's rebellion or motives, but rather the king of Babylon's pride and downfall. It is not a reliable source for understanding Lucifer's character or history. Did Lucifer have 1/3 of the angels on his side and fight a war in heaven? Another common and popular interpretation of Lucifer's rebellion is that he had a large number of followers among the angels, and that he led them in a war against God and his loyal angels in heaven. This interpretation is based on a passage in Revelation 12:4, 7-9, where the Apostle John sees a vision of a dragon, Satan, and his angels fighting against Michael and his angels. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child he might devour it. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Many people have assumed that this passage is a historical account of Lucifer's rebellion and fall from heaven, and that the stars that he swept down with his tail are the angels that he persuaded to join him. However, this assumption is not supported by the biblical context or the literary genre. Here are some reasons why this interpretation is problematic. The passage is not a historical account, but a symbolic vision. The book of Revelation is full of symbols and images that represent spiritual realities and events. The dragon is not a literal creature, but a symbol of Satan, the enemy of God and his people. The stars are not literal celestial bodies, but symbols of God's people, especially Israel. The woman is not a literal person, but a symbol of God's faithful community, from whom the Messiah, the child, came. The war in heaven is not a literal battle, but a symbol of the spiritual conflict between God and Satan over the destiny of humanity. The passage is not about Lucifer's rebellion, but about Satan's defeat. The context of the passage shows that it is part of a larger vision that spans from chapter 12 to chapter 14. The vision describes how Satan tried to destroy the Messiah, the child, and his followers, the woman and her offspring, but failed. The war in heaven is one of the scenes that illustrate how Satan was overcome by God's power and authority. The passage does not explain how or when Satan became evil, but rather how he was cast out of heaven and lost his access to accuse God's people before him. The passage is not about 1/3 of the angels, but about 1/3 of Israel. The image of 1/3 of the stars being swept down by the dragon's tail is based on an Old Testament prophecy in Zechariah 13 verses 8 to 9, where God says that he will refine Israel through a time of distress, and that only 1/3 will survive and be purified. The Apostle John uses this image to show how Satan tried to destroy Israel, God's chosen people, through persecution and deception. The image does not refer to angels who followed Satan, but to Israelites who were killed or led astray by him. Therefore, this passage does not describe Lucifer's rebellion or followers, but rather Satan's defeat and downfall. It is not a reliable source for understanding Lucifer's character or history.